let me tell you something. Let me tell you something that happened in a courtroom, a real American courtroom, that should stop you cold, not metaphorically cold, not politically cold. I mean the kind of cold that creeps up the back of your neck when you realize that something you thought was impossible just happened right in front of everyone, on the record, with witnesses, with cameras, with marshals standing by. Because here is what we know tonight: a federal judge, sitting in a court of law in the United States of America, looked at the evidence before them, looked at the conduct on the record, looked at the violations that had been documented, time-stamped, and handed to the court in black and white, and made a decision that does not get made lightly. A decision that sends a message so loud, so seismic, so legally consequential that the echoes of it are still reverberating through every hallway of power in Washington tonight. The judge revoked bail. Let that sit for just a moment. Not suspended, not modified, not warned about, revoked completely, immediately, with U.S. Marshals physically present and ready to move. And move they did, instantly, without hesitation, without delay, because when a federal judge revokes bail and looks at the marshals in that courtroom, the marshals do not wait for a press release. They do not wait for a political consultant to craft the narrative. They move, and tonight they moved. Now, here's why this matters. Here's why this is not just another legal headline buried under the avalanche of chaos that passes for American political news in this era. The reason this matters, and I need you to hear this, is because bail revocation at this level, with this speed, with this decisiveness, is the court system telling the entire country something. It is telling you that the evidence crossed a threshold. It is telling you that the conduct was so egregious, so flagrant, so impossible to ignore, that a sitting federal judge looked at all of it and said, "One, enough, no more. This ends now," and it ended now. At approximately, and I want you to hold on to this timestamp because it is going to matter. In the morning session, before the lunch recess, before the defense team had fully processed what was happening, the gavel came down. The ruling was read into the record, and the marshals, who had been standing at the back of that courtroom because someone in that building knew what was coming, closed in instantly, not slowly, not reluctantly, instantly. And I want you to think about what that means, because U.S. Marshals do not simply appear in a courtroom by coincidence. They are positioned, they are briefed. Somebody with authority, somebody with knowledge of what that judge was about to do before that ruling was read aloud. That is not a small detail. That is indictment level gravity dressed up as courtroom procedure. Wait for it. Because the story does not end with the marshals closing in. The story does not end with bail being revoked. The story is just beginning. And what comes next? The paper trail, the communications, the leaked internal messages, the testimony of witnesses who were inside that orbit. What comes next is the part that should make every single person watching this channel sit up straight and pay very close attention. Before we go any further, and I mean this, if you are watching this right now and you have not subscribed to this channel, do it now. Hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, because what we are about to walk through together, the documents, the timeline, the legal analysis, is the kind of reporting that you will not get anywhere else presented the way we are going to present it to you tonight. This is not opinion. This is the record. This is the paper trail. And we are going to follow it together all the way to the end. Because the end tonight is just the beginning. Stay with me. The reason this matters, and the reason I keep coming back to this phrase, is because in American political and legal history, the moments that define eras are rarely the loud ones. They are rarely the ones with the most television coverage or the most social media noise. The moments that define eras are the quiet ones, the gavel coming down, the marshals moving in, the defendant's face in the split second before reality lands. This was one of those moments. And we have the receipts, we have the documents, we have the timeline, we have sources, plural, multiple, independently corroborated sources who were inside that orbit when the decision came down. And what they are telling us about the panic, about the phone calls, about the frantic messages flying back and forth in the minutes and hours before that gavel fell, it is the kind of inside account that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Not one source, not two, but three separate independent sources with direct knowledge of what was happening inside that room and inside those communications. Here's where we get into the paper trail. And I want you to buckle in, because this is the part of the story where the abstract becomes concrete, where the political becomes legal, where the allegedly gets quietly dropped from the sentence, because what we are looking at now is documented. It is time-stamped. It is in writing. And it has been handed to the court, to the let's go back. Let's go all the way back to the beginning of this, because that is how you understand the magnitude of what happened in that courtroom today. You do not understand the detonation unless you understand the fuse. And this fuse, this particular fuse, was lit a long time ago, long before the cameras showed up, long before the marshals were positioned at the back of that courtroom, long before anyone outside of a very small, very tight, very panicked inner circle understood what was coming. Here's what the documents show. In the weeks leading up to today's ruling, and I want to be precise here because precision is everything when you are talking about a federal legal proceeding, there was a pattern of behavior that was being logged, documented, and quietly handed up to the courts that most people never see and rarely hear about. We are talking about communications, internal communications, the kind that people send when they believe, wrongly it turns out, catastrophically wrongly. No one the one as it's always a box, emails, text messages, encrypted messages on platforms that are not as encrypted as their users believed, and phone calls. And phone calls that were either recorded by parties to those calls or described in sworn testimony by individuals who were present for them, not alleged to have been present on the record under oath. Now, here's the TikTok. Here's the timeline that the court had in front of it when that judge made the decision to revoke bail. And I want you to follow this carefully because each piece builds on the last. First, communication, and this is documented. A message goes out from inside the defendant's orbit to an individual whose name you will hear again before the story is over. The substance of that message, and this has been described to us by a source with direct knowledge of its contents, is not ambiguous. It is not open to interpretation. It is a direct, explicit, unmistakable attempt to influence the proceedings, to shape what a witness would say, to nudge, and that word nudge is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting here, so let me replace it with the accurate word, to pressure a witness. That is communication number one. Communication number two comes approximately 4 hours later. Different platform, different recipient, same unmistakable intent. And this one is worse because this one is not a nudge. This one is not even a pressure. This one, according to the source who described it to us, reads like a directive, like an instruction, like someone who has either forgotten or simply stopped caring that federal courts take witness tampering with a seriousness that is difficult to overstate. The reason this matters, and here's where the paper trail starts to glow, is because both of these communications were flagged. They were flagged internally, first by someone inside that orbit who had enough legal awareness to understand what they were looking at and enough personal self-preservation instinct to make sure they were not holding the bag when the roof came down. That individual, and I want to be careful here because their cooperation with the court is ongoing, that individual made decide the kind of decision that changes the trajectory of a legal case. They documented what they had seen, they preserved it, and they handed it over, not to a journalist, not to a political operative, to the court. 3 separate communications, 3 separate attempts to interfere with the integrity of a federal proceeding, each one documented, each one time-stamped, each one now sitting in the record of a federal court case, and which means it is permanent, which means it does not go away when the news cycle moves on, which means a judge looked at all 3 of them and made the decision that bail was no longer an option. That is the paper trail, and we are not done with it yet. Because here's the part that made my jaw drop when our team first laid it out, the leaked internal emails, not the communications going outward, the communications going inward, the emails flying around inside the defendant's own team in the 48 hours before today's ruling. And what those emails reveal about the level of awareness inside that orbit, like the awareness that this was coming, that the ground was shifting, that the judge had seen what the judge had seen, that the kind of thing that makes you understand why those marshals were already in position when the gavel came down, because they knew. Inside that orbit, they knew. And I will tell you exactly what those emails say. And so, wikwe atelai wanziso about the panic that was spreading through that inner circle like a brush fire. Right after this. Wait for it. Because here's what the first leaked internal email that's sent approximately 36 hours before the bail revocation actually reveals. It reveals that at least one senior member of that legal team had already begun what can only be described as a quiet, careful, deliberate preparation for the possibility that bail would be revoked, not a contingency plan discussed openly, not a memo circulated to the full team, a quiet, private, almost furtive set of arrangements being made by someone who had read the room. And the room was saying, this is over. Not one person inside that orbit saw it coming, not two, but three separate individuals. Three had begun making arrangements, having conversations, sending messages that only make sense if you already know what the outcome is going to be. Let me tell you about panic, real panic, not the kind that shows up on a press conference podium with a prepared statement and a team of communications professionals standing just off camera, not the performative panic that gets workshopped in a green room before it goes on television. I mean, the raw, unfiltered, 3 a.m. kind of panic that shows up in messages that were never supposed to be seen by anyone outside of a very small, very trusted, very wrong circle of people who thought they were safe. Because that is what we are looking at tonight. That is what the leaked internal communications reveal when you read them. And I mean actually read them, not skim them, not process them through the filter of spin that the other side has already begun deploying. When you sit down with these documents and you go line by line, timestamp by timestamp, you are not reading the communications of a legal team that is confident. You are not reading the communications of people who believe they have the situation under control. You are reading the communications of people who absolutely know that the walls are closing in. And here's the TikTok of that panic. Here's the minute-by-minute breakdown of what was happening inside that orbit in the final hours before the gavel came down. 32 hours before the bail revocation, an email, me internal, marked with the kind of casual subject line that people use when they are trying not to draw attention to the contents, goes out to 3 members of the inner legal circle. The substance of that email, as described to us by a source with direct firsthand knowledge, is a question. A simple, devastating, tell me everything question. The question being asked, in essence, is this: how bad is it? Not, is it bad? Not, could it be bad? How bad is it? Present tense. Assumed reality. The person sending that email already knows it is bad. They are trying to quantify the damage. The response comes back in under 20 minutes. Under 20 minutes. Now, I want you to think about that response time for just a moment, because when a senior member of a legal team sends a how bad is it email in the middle of a federal proceeding and gets a response in under 20 minutes, that tells you something. That tells you that the person on the other end of that email was not doing anything else. They were not in a meeting. They were not on another call. They were sitting there waiting because they already knew the question was coming, because they had already been thinking about the answer. The response, and again, this is from a source with direct knowledge of the contents, the response does not reassure, it does not minimize, it does not deploy the kind of carefully calibrated legal language designed to make a bad situation sound manageable. The response, according to our source, is blunt to the point of being almost shocking in its candor. It says, in terms that leave very little room for interpretation, that the documentation in the court's possession is, and I want to use the precise characterization our source provided, catastrophic. Catastrophic, that word used internally by someone inside the legal team about their own situation 32 hours before the judge revoked bail. That is not spin. That is not opposition research. That is a primary source inside the defendant's own orbit using the word catastrophic to describe the state of their legal position. And that word, and that single devastating, professionally chosen word from someone who understands exactly what it means in a federal legal context, and that word is now part of the record. And the paper trail does not stop there, because 20 hours before the bail revocation, and here's where the TikTok gets truly extraordinary, a second round of internal communications begins. And this round is different in character from the first round. The first round was about assessment, about understanding the damage, about quantifying how bad it was. The second round is about something else entirely. The second round is about blame. Not one person inside that orbit was pointing fingers, not 2, but 3 separate threads of internal communication, 3 simultaneously erupting into what can only be described as a blame cascade, a full-scale, no-holds-barred, completely unambiguous internal reckoning about who made the decisions that led to this moment, who sent the communications that the court now had in its possession, who thought it was acceptable, who genuinely thought it was acceptable. To engage in the kind of conduct that a federal judge would look at and say, no, no more, bail revoked, marshals move in, 3 separate blame cascades simultaneously. And here's what those blame cascades reveal. And beyond the obvious revelation that the people inside this orbit are now turning on each other with a speed and a ferocity that should tell you everything you need to know about the state of that defense. Here's what they reveal about the decision-making process that led to this moment. Because embedded in those blame cascades between the accusations and the recriminations and the "this was your idea" and the "I told you not to," there are admissions. Quiet, almost incidental admissions that slip through the cracks of the argument like water through a fist. Admissions about what was known, admissions about when it was known, admissions about decisions that were made deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of the risk because the people making those decisions believed, apparently right up until the moment the gavel came down, that they were untouchable, that the rules that apply to everyone else in a federal proceeding did not apply to them, that the judge would not go this far, that the marshals would not actually move. Like, they were wrong. Proverbially, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. And here's what makes this TikTok so significant. Here's what elevates this beyond a standard legal drama into something that legal scholars are going to be writing about for years. The timeline itself, the documented, time-stamped, court-verified timeline of communications shows a pattern that is not accidental. It is not coincidental. It is not the result of poor judgment spread randomly across a series of unrelated decisions. The timeline shows a pattern of deliberate, coordinated, escalating conduct that a federal judge looked at in its totality and made a determination about. That determination was revoke the bail. Now, here is what our third independent source, the one with knowledge not of the communications, but of the internal conversations happening in the room, face to face, off the record, off the devices. Here is what that source told us about the moment the word came down inside that orbit that the judge had made the ruling. Silence, complete silence for several seconds that apparently felt to everyone in that room like several minutes. And this detail, this specific human detail, is the one that has stayed with me since our source described it. One person in that room started laughing. Not laughing with relief. Not laughing with disbelief. Laughing with the specific, hollow, slightly unhinged quality of someone who has just watched their worst fear materialize in real time and has no other available response. One person laughed, and then the room erupted. And the marshals, and who were already in position, already briefed, already moving, closed in. I want to talk about what happens next, not what might happen, not what could happen under certain political conditions or depending on how the appellate process unfolds or contingent on any of the 17 variables that the spin machine on the other side is already busy introducing into the conversation to create the impression of uncertainty where the record is actually quite clear. I want to talk about what the record, the actual documented, court-verified, time-stamped record, tells us is coming, because the record is not ambiguous tonight. The record is not hedging. The record is pointing in one direction with the kind of clarity that makes serious legal observers uncomfortable, because serious legal observers understand what it means when the evidence lines up this cleanly. It means the fallout is going to be significant. And I mean significant in the precise legal, historically grounded sense of that word. Not significant as in politically embarrassing, not significant as in a bad news cycle for the people involved. Significant as in the kind of fallout that reshapes the landscape. Right? The kind of fallout that forces everyone who has been sitting on the sidelines, like everyone who has been watching and calculating and deciding how close to stand to the flame, to make a new calculation, a harder calculation. The kind of calculation that people make when they suddenly understand that the accountability they thought was theoretical has become very, very real. And here is what that fallout looks like. Here is what the political seismograph is showing tonight in the hours since those marshals closed in. First, the immediate political orbit, the people who have been publicly associated with the defendant, who have lent their names, their platforms, their political credibility to the effort of creating the impression that this was all manageable, all containable, all ultimately going to resolve itself in a way that did not require anyone to face genuine consequences. Those people are having conversations tonight that they did not expect to be having. Quiet conversations, off-the-record conversations. The kind of conversations that happen in the margins of the public story, in the phone calls that do not get logged, in the meetings that do not appear on any official calendar. And what those conversations are about, what our sources tell us those conversations are circling around with increasing urgency, is a single, simple, devastating question. The question is not what happens to the defendant. The question is what happens to us. What does this, ruling mean for the people who stood up and said this was fine, like who went on television and said this was being handled, who issued statements and made appearances and deployed the full apparatus of political spin in the service of creating the impression that the walls were not closing in. The walls closed in. And now the people who said they would not are facing a reckoning of their own. Not necessarily a legal reckoning, though for some of them, depending on what the paper trail reveals in its next chapter, that possibility is not off the table, but a political reckoning, a credibility reckoning. The kind of reckoning that comes when you have publicly, repeatedly on the record staked your reputation on an outcome, and the outcome turns out to be the opposite of everything you promised. Not one political ally is quietly recalibrating tonight, not two, but three separate sources with knowledge of conversations happening inside that broader political orbit are telling us that the recalibration is widespread, it is urgent, and it has the specific character of people who are trying to figure out how to create distance without appearing to create distance, how to separate themselves from a sinking situation without the separation being visible enough to raise questions about why they're separating. Three sources, three independent accounts of the same phenomenon happening simultaneously tonight. That is not coincidence. That is a political ecosystem responding to a seismic event. And the way a political ecosystem responds to a seismic event tells you something crucial about the magnitude of the event itself, because political allies do not quietly recalibrate when the situation is manageable, and they do not create careful distance when they believe the story is going to resolve itself favorably. They recalibrate and distance when they have looked at the evidence, and the same evidence the judge looked at, the same paper trail we have been walking through tonight, and made their own determination. Their determination matches the judge's. And then there is Congress, because what happens in a federal courtroom does not stay in a federal courtroom, not when the implications of the ruling extend into the political and constitutional territory that this one does. And tonight on Capitol Hill, the response to today's bail revocation is telling in its own right, not because of what is being said loudly and publicly, as the statements, the press releases, the carefully worded reactions designed to thread the needle between acknowledging reality and maintaining whatever political positioning each member has staked out. Those public statements are frankly the least interesting thing happening on the Hill tonight. What is interesting, what is genuinely revelatory, fun, is what is being said quietly in the cloakrooms, in the hallways, in the conversations between members who have known each other long enough to dispense with the spin and speak plainly about what they are seeing, and what they're saying plainly, according to sources with knowledge of those conversations, is that today's ruling changes the calculus for everyone on both sides of the aisle, because judicial decisiveness of this magnitude, a federal judge revoking bail based on a documented pattern of conduct within a federal proceeding, does not leave a lot of room for the kind of both sides ambiguity that allows political figures to avoid taking a position. The judge took a position. The marshals enforced it. And now everyone who has been avoiding a position is going to have to decide whether they can afford to keep avoiding it, because the paper trail that led to today's ruling does not end with today's ruling. The paper trail continues. The investigation continues. The testimony of the witnesses who are cooperating, of course, and who made the decision to document what they saw and hand it to the court, that testimony is not complete. It is ongoing. And every person on Capitol Hill who understands how federal investigations work, understands what ongoing testimony from cooperating witnesses inside a defendant's orbit actually means. It means more is coming. And here's the part that the Harvard legal scholar said when we pushed past the formal analysis into the genuine human stakes of this moment. Here's what they said when we asked not about the legal mechanics, but about the political and institutional fallout of a ruling like today's. They said, and these are not their exact words, but the precise substance of what they communicated, they said that the political fallout from a judicial determination of this magnitude is almost always underestimated in the immediate aftermath. Almost always. Because in the immediate aftermath, the spin machine is at full capacity. The deflection is at maximum volume. The alternative narratives are being deployed with every tool available to the people whose interests are served by minimizing what just happened. But the paper trail does not minimize. The paper trail does not spin. The paper trail sits in the record of a federal court, permanent and immovable, and it waits. It waits for the noise to die down. It waits for the spin to exhaust itself. It waits for the moment when the political and media landscape has moved on to the next crisis, the next controversy, the next detonation, and then it resurfaces in a filing, in a hearing, in testimony that builds on the testimony that came before it, in a ruling that builds on the ruling that came before it. The paper trail always resurfaces. And the Georgetown scholar, with the one whose analysis of today's ruling as a textbook example of institutional accountability functioning at its highest level I shared with you earlier, that scholar added something in our follow-up conversation that I have not been able to stop thinking about since they said it. They said that what distinguishes this moment from other moments of apparent legal consequence in recent American political history is the completeness of the documented record. The degree to which the conduct that led to today's ruling was not alleged, not inferred, not reconstructed from circumstantial evidence, but documented, preserved, handed to the court by people who were inside the orbit and made the decision at personal and professional risk to ensure that what they witnessed did not disappear. That decision and the decision of those witnesses to document and preserve and hand over what they had is the decision that made today possible, is the decision that put those marshals in that courtroom, is the decision that will drive whatever comes next. And what comes next? What that documented record, the ongoing testimony, the continuing investigation, the political recalibration happening tonight in offices and cloakrooms and quiet phone calls across this city, what all of it is pointing toward is a reckoning that is not finished. That is nowhere near finished. That has, if the historical parallels hold, and tonight they are holding with a precision that is almost eerie, that has barely begun. The proverbial smoking gun to Rzai. The absolute legal chaos is just getting started. And the people who thought this would not go this far, the people who sent those messages and made those arrangements and laughed that hollow laugh in the moment before the marshals moved in, those people are sitting somewhere tonight in the specific silence of people who have run out of moves, understanding something that the rest of us are only beginning to process. It is over. Not the story, not the investigation, not the fallout, not the reckoning, just the part where accountability was still theoretical. That part is over. Watch this space.